At the bank, they told me my $2.5 million was gone, I said, and my daughter-in-law smiled like she had been waiting her whole life to hear those words. The fluorescent lights above us hummed softly, casting that pale, unforgiving glow over everything: the polished marble floors, the glass partitions, the neat little line of customers behind us pretending not to listen. I stood there at the counter, my hands resting lightly on the cool surface, the printed statement still warm from the machine in front of me. I didn't grip it. I didn't crumple it. I simply looked at the numbers again, as if they might rearrange themselves out of embarrassment. Balance, $412.67. That was all that remained. $2.5 million, built over 43 years of careful saving, investing, and saying no when it would have been easier to say yes, gone. There must be some mistake, I said quietly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. The young man behind the counter glanced at his screen again, then back at me, his expression tightening just enough to betray discomfort. I understand this is concerning, ma'am, he said, lowering his voice, but the transactions appear to be authorized. Authorized. Such a polite word for something that felt like being erased. I nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if I were considering a restaurant recommendation instead of the disappearance of my life's work. Beside me, Vanessa shifted her weight ever so slightly, the soft click of her heels against the marble echoing in the quiet space. I turned my head just enough to see her. She wasn't looking at the screen. She wasn't looking at the teller. She was looking at me. And she was smiling. Not broadly. Not cruelly. Just a small, contained smile, the kind you wear when everything is going exactly as planned. I held her gaze for a moment. She didn't look away. That was when I knew. Not suspected. Not wondered. Knew. I turned back to the counter and slid the statement toward myself, folding it neatly along the crease, as if it were nothing more than a receipt for groceries. Could you show me the transaction history for the past 18 months? I asked. The teller hesitated, then nodded, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The printer hummed again, spitting out page after page. I watched them stack up, each sheet a quiet confession. Large withdrawals. Wire transfers. Structured amounts that didn't draw attention all at once, but accumulated like a slow leak no one bothered to fix. I didn't reach for the papers immediately. Instead, I glanced once more at Vanessa. She had already composed her face into something softer now, something concerned. Margaret, maybe we should sit down, she said gently, placing a hand near my elbow but not quite touching me. This is a lot to process. Her voice was warm, caring, practiced. I almost admired it. Almost. I straightened slightly, just enough to remove any need for her support. I'm fine, I said. And I was. That was the strangest part. No shaking hands. No racing heart. Just a quiet, settling clarity, like dust finally finding its place after a long disturbance. The teller handed me the full report, his eyes avoiding mine now. If you have any questions, we can have a manager assist you, he offered. I gave a small nod, gathering the papers into a single, precise stack. Not today, I said. Because questions require uncertainty. And I had none left. As we stepped away from the counter, I could feel the eyes of the room shift, curiosity flickering and fading as quickly as it came. To them, it was just another customer, another problem. But to me, it was something else entirely. It was an ending. Or perhaps, the beginning of something I had been too trusting to see before. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright, almost offensively cheerful. Vanessa slipped on her sunglasses, her smile returning in that subtle, satisfied way. I told you we should have checked things sooner, she said lightly, as if this were a shared oversight, a minor inconvenience we would handle together. I looked at her then, really looked, taking in every detail I had once chosen to ignore. The perfect hair. The effortless composure. The way she stood just half a step ahead, as if she had always known where this path would lead. I didn't say a word. Not in the bank. Not on the walk to the car. Not even. When she started the engine and glanced at me, waiting for some reaction she could manage, soften, redirect. I simply folded the papers once more and placed them carefully in my purse. Silence, I realized, was not weakness. It was space. And in that space, something steady and deliberate began to form. Because while Vanessa believed she had taken everything from me, she had made one very small, very critical mistake. She thought I didn't understand what had just happened. And that, more than anything, was going to cost her. I had always believed that money, when handled carefully, could protect you from uncertainty, that if you planned enough, saved enough, trusted the right people, you could build something solid enough to stand on for the rest of your life. And for years that belief had carried me through everything from market downturns to the quiet loneliness that settled in after my husband passed, because even when the house felt too quiet, even when the evenings stretched longer than I liked, there was always the comfort of knowing that what we had built together was still there, intact, waiting, reliable in a way that people sometimes were not, and that was why I had agreed when Daniel first suggested that it might be easier if someone helped me manage things. Not because I could not understand my own finances, but because I was tired, and grief has a way of making even the simplest tasks feel heavier than they should. So when Vanessa offered to step in, to organize statements, to streamline accounts, to make sure everything was optimized, I let her, slowly at first, giving her small responsibilities, letting her sit beside me at the dining room table as we went through paperwork together, watching as she nodded thoughtfully, asked the right questions, used words like efficiency and structure and long-term planning, and it all sounded so reasonable, so helpful, that I began to step back just a little more each time, until eventually the stack of unopened envelopes on the kitchen counter no longer felt like something I needed to address immediately, because Vanessa had already assured me she was keeping track of everything. And I remember one afternoon, about 6 months after my husband's funeral, when she came over with a folder neatly organized with tabs, each labeled in her careful handwriting, and she placed it in front of me with a small, reassuring smile, telling me that she had consolidated several of my accounts to make things easier to monitor, that she had spoken with the bank about better options, that everything was now more efficient, and I had looked at those tabs, at the clean lines and the order she had created, and I had felt something close to relief, because it meant one less thing to think about, one less reminder of all the responsibilities that had once been shared and were now mine alone. And when she slid a document toward me and pointed to the signature line, explaining that it would allow her to assist with transactions if needed, I did not hesitate the way I might have years ago. I did not ask as many questions as I should have, because she was family, because she was married to my son, because she spoke with such quiet confidence that it felt almost unnecessary to doubt her, and so I signed, not once, but several times over the following months, small updates, minor adjustments, each one presented as a simple step toward making my life easier. And I did not notice how the mail changed, how fewer statements arrived in my name, how Vanessa began to summarize things for me instead of showing me the details, how she would say, "Everything looks good," before I even had the chance to ask, and Daniel, when he was around, would nod in agreement, distracted, trusting her in the same easy way that I had started to, and looking back now, I can see how carefully it was done, not rushed, not obvious, but gradual. Like someone dimming the lights one notch at a time until the room feels different, but you cannot quite say when it changed. And I remember the last time I tried to log into one of my accounts myself, how the password I had used for years no longer worked. And Vanessa had laughed softly, telling me she had updated the security settings to keep everything safe, offering to handle it for me so I would not have to worry about remembering new information, and I had accepted that too. Because it seemed reasonable, because it felt like care, and because I did not yet understand that each small convenience was another step away from control, another quiet shift in ownership that I had not agreed to in the way I believed I had. And now, sitting in the passenger seat of her car as we drove away from the bank, the stack of transaction reports resting silently in my purse, I could see the pattern clearly for the first time, every moment aligning with a precision that left no room for doubt, and I realized that nothing about this had been sudden, nothing about it had been accidental. It had been built slowly, patiently, with the same kind of discipline I had once used to build my savings. Only this time I had not been the one in control, and as Vanessa glanced at me briefly before returning her eyes to the road, her expression calm, almost expectant. I understood that she was waiting for something, perhaps for confusion, for questions, for a reaction she could manage. But I gave her none, because the truth had already settled into place, and there was nothing left to clarify, only something to decide. The car ride home was quiet in a way that felt carefully constructed, as if even silence had been arranged in advance, and Vanessa kept both hands on the wheel, her posture relaxed, her movements smooth and controlled. The kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly how a situation is supposed to unfold, and every now and then she would glance at me, not long enough to seem obvious, but just enough to measure something, to check for signs she could interpret: confusion, distress, anger. Anything she could step in to manage, but I gave her nothing to work with. I sat with my hands folded loosely in my lap, feeling the gentle hum of the road beneath us, watching the familiar streets pass by as if I were seeing them for the first time. Because in a way everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same anymore, and that realization settled into me with a strange sense of calm, not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from understanding, from seeing clearly what had once been hidden in plain sight. And after a few minutes, she finally spoke, her voice soft, carefully balanced between concern and reassurance. "I know that was a lot back there, Margaret, but we will figure it out. Sometimes banks make errors, or things get processed in ways that look worse than they are." And I turned my head slightly, just enough to acknowledge her words without fully engaging, and I nodded once, slow and measured. "Yes," I said, because it was easier to agree than to explain, and because I was not interested in hearing the version of reality she was preparing to offer. Not yet, not when I could already see the outline of the truth for myself, and she seemed to take that small response as permission to continue, filling the space with gentle explanations about paperwork and timing and how sometimes large accounts can appear different when viewed a certain way, her words flowing smoothly, practiced, as if she had rehearsed them in quieter moments when no one was listening. And I let her speak, not interrupting, not questioning, simply listening in the same way I might listen to a distant radio, aware of the sound but not drawn into it. And when we pulled into my driveway, she turned off the engine and looked at me fully for the first time since we left the bank. Her expression open, expectant. "Why do not you let me come in with you?" she said gently. "We can go over everything together. Make sure you understand what is happening." And for a brief moment, I considered what she expected to happen next. The two of us sitting at my kitchen table, her laying out carefully selected documents, guiding me through a version of events that would leave just enough ambiguity to keep me uncertain, dependent, manageable, and I could almost see the scene play out. The way it must have before, the way it had worked every time she needed it to, but that version of me, the one who needed to be guided, who accepted explanations without question, who trusted because it was easier than doubting, that version had been left behind somewhere between the bank counter and the passenger seat of this car, and I opened the door, stepping out into the warm afternoon air, feeling the solid ground beneath my feet in a way that felt newly significant, and I turned back to her, offering a small, polite smile. "That will not be necessary," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle, and for the first time, something flickered in her expression. Not fear, not yet, but a brief disruption. Like a ripple across still water, and she recovered quickly. Of course she did, nodding as if she understood, as if this were a reasonable choice. "All right," she said, her tone light, "but call me if you need anything, okay?" And I nodded. Again, closing the car door with quiet finality, watching as she drove away, her car disappearing down the street until it was just another passing vehicle, indistinguishable from the rest, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Not because I was unsure of what to do next, but because I was allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just shifted, not in panic, not in anger, but in clarity. And when I finally walked inside, the house greeted me with the same stillness it always had, the same familiar arrangement of furniture, the same soft light filtering through the curtains, but there was a difference now. Subtle but undeniable, as if the space itself had been waiting for me to see it differently, and I moved through it slowly. Setting my purse down on the kitchen counter, removing the stack of papers with deliberate care, placing them neatly beside the fruit bowl as if they were part of the ordinary rhythm of the day, and I did not rush to read them again. I did not call anyone, I did not sit down in confusion. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water, took a slow sip, and let the silence settle around me, because there is a moment when everything becomes clear, where action is less important than understanding, and I was not interested in reacting. Not yet. I was interested in seeing the full shape of what had been done, and more importantly, in deciding exactly how I would respond. Because whatever came next would not be rushed, it would not be emotional, and it would not be something Vanessa could anticipate. And as I stood there in my own kitchen, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of satisfaction, but of recognition, because for the first time since this began, I was no longer trying to keep up with someone else's plan. I was beginning to form my own. I sat at the kitchen table as the light shifted slowly across the floor, the kind of quiet afternoon that used to feel peaceful now carrying a different weight, and I reached for the stack of papers, not with urgency, but with intention. Sliding the top sheet free and letting my eyes move across the numbers one line at a time, each transaction laid out in clean, in personal detail, dates, amounts, routing numbers, all precise, all documented, all real, and the pattern revealed itself quickly. Not chaotic, not careless, but deliberate, structured in a way that avoided attention, smaller transfers at first, amounts that would not raise concern, then gradually larger, more confident, as if whoever was behind it had grown comfortable. Certain that no one was watching closely enough to notice, and I turned the page, then another, each one confirming what I already understood. This had not happened overnight. This had been built, step by step, decision by decision, over months, and what struck me most was not the loss itself, but the patience it required, the discipline, because this was not the work of someone acting on impulse. This was someone who had planned, someone who had studied the system, someone who had taken the time to learn exactly how far they could go without being questioned, and I paused for a moment, letting that realization settle, because it told me something important. It told me that this was not just about money. It was about control, about access, about the quiet confidence of believing you could take something that did not belong to you and never be held accountable for it. And I leaned back slightly in my chair, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, thinking back to the moments that had once seemed so ordinary, the times Vanessa had suggested small changes, the way she had framed everything as helpful, efficient, necessary, and I could see now how carefully those moments had been arranged, how each one had served a purpose, how each small decision had led to this larger outcome, and I reached for the next page, scanning the recipient details more closely, and there it was, repeated again and again in slightly different forms, business names that sounded legitimate at first glance, consulting services, management firms, investment facilitators, but the more I looked, the more familiar they became, subtle variations of the same structure, the same address patterns, the same routing paths, and I felt a quiet certainty settle into place. This was not a network of unrelated transactions. It was a single thread woven through different names, different fronts, but leading to the same place, and I did not need to see the final endpoint to understand who had tied it together. And I folded the page carefully, placing it back onto the stack, not out of hesitation, but because I had seen enough for now, and I stood, walking slowly to the window, looking out at the backyard where nothing had changed, the same trimmed hedges, the same wooden fence, the same stillness that had always been there, and yet everything felt different, not because something new had been added, but because something hidden had been revealed, and I thought about Daniel, about the way he had trusted Vanessa without question, the way he had stepped back from anything that felt complicated or uncomfortable, and I wondered, not with anger, but with clarity, how much he truly knew, whether he had seen any of this, or whether he had simply accepted what was placed in front of him, the same way I had, and I turned back to the table, my gaze settling once more on the papers, and I realized that whatever role he had played, intentional or not, it did not change what had been done. And it did not change what needed to happen next, and I moved the stack into a neat pile, aligning the edges with quiet precision, because there is something grounding in order, in structure, especially when everything else has shifted, and I placed my hand on top of it for a moment, not in possession, but in acknowledgement, as if marking the point where one chapter had ended and another was about to begin, and I did not reach for the phone, I did not call the bank, I did not confront anyone, because action taken too quickly is often guided by emotion, and emotion can be anticipated, managed, redirected. And I had no interest in giving that advantage to someone who had already proven how well they could operate within that space. Instead, I walked to the hallway, opened the small drawer where I kept documents that mattered, the ones I had not handed over, the ones I had kept out of habit more than intention, and I took out a single folder, placing it beside the stack from the bank, and I opened it slowly, reviewing its contents with the same careful attention: property records, older account statements, copies of documents that predated Vanessa's involvement, pieces of a history that had not been altered, not yet, and as I compared them in my mind to what I had just seen, the contrast was clear, the shift undeniable, and I closed the folder gently, resting my hand on it for a brief moment before stepping back. Because what I needed now was not more information, it was a plan, and plans require time, clarity, and a willingness to move without being seen until it is too late to stop. And as the last of the afternoon light began to fade, I turned off the kitchen light, leaving the papers exactly where they were, untouched, visible, because sometimes the most powerful move is not to hide what you know, but to let it sit in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be understood. The next morning arrived with the same quiet stillness, but I moved through it differently, not slower, not heavier, just more aware, as if every action carried a purpose that had not existed before, and I made my coffee the same way I always had, measuring carefully, waiting for the familiar sound of it brewing, but instead of sitting down right away, I stood by the counter, looking at the papers where I had left them, untouched, exactly as they were, because sometimes the best way to understand something is to let it remain undisturbed until you are ready to see it clearly, and when I finally sat, I did not begin with the most recent transactions, I went back further, flipping through older statements from the folder I had taken out the night before, comparing dates, amounts, patterns, letting the timeline stretch out in front of me until it became something I could follow without guessing, and it did not take long to find the first shift, small enough to be dismissed at the time. A single transfer that had been explained as a necessary adjustment, then another, slightly larger, then a series of structured movements that followed a rhythm, not random, not careless, but deliberate, and I traced them forward, month by month, watching how the numbers changed, how the amounts increased just enough to matter but not enough to alarm, and I realized that this had not been about taking everything at once. It had been about taking enough, consistently, quietly, until there was nothing left to take. And I leaned back in my chair, the coffee cooling beside me, and I thought about how easily I had accepted each explanation, how readily I had stepped aside when it was presented as help, and there was no anger in that thought, only clarity, because understanding how something happens is more useful than blaming yourself for not seeing it sooner. And as I turned another page, something else became clear. The timing of certain transfers aligned with specific moments. Times when I had been distracted, when I had been dealing with something else, a medical appointment, a family gathering, a week when I had been too tired to review anything closely, and that told me something else about the person behind it. Not just that they were patient, but that they were observant, that they paid attention not only to the accounts, but to me, to my routines, my habits, my moments of vulnerability, and I set the paper down carefully, because that realization mattered. It meant this had never been just about opportunity, it had been about strategy, and I stood, walking slowly to the sink, rinsing my cup even though it was not empty, simply to give my hands something to do while my thoughts settled into place, and when I turned back, I did not go to the table right away. Instead, I reached for my phone, not to call Vanessa, not to confront Daniel, but to scroll through my contacts until I found a name I had not used in years, a number That had been given to me long before any of this began, and I paused for a moment, my finger resting just above the screen, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that once I made this call, things would begin to move in a direction that could not be undone, and I lowered my hand without dialing, setting the phone back down beside the papers, because timing matters, and there is a difference between knowing what to do and choosing the exact moment to do it. And I returned to the table, gathering the documents into a single stack, aligning them once more, not out of habit, but as a quiet confirmation that everything was now in its place, at least for me, and I slid them into a plain folder, one that did not stand out, one that could sit among other things without drawing attention, and I closed it gently, placing it back on the counter where it could be seen but not questioned, and then I moved through the rest of the morning as I always had, making small adjustments to the rhythm of my day without changing it enough to be noticed, because whatever came next would require more than just understanding. It would require patience, and as the hours passed, I found myself thinking less about what had been taken and more about what had been assumed, because Vanessa had not just taken money, she had taken control under the belief that I would not notice, or worse, that I would notice and not know what to do about it. And that assumption, more than anything else, was where her plan began to weaken, because it meant she was not watching for the right things. She was not preparing for the possibility that I might see everything and choose not to react immediately, and that gave me something far more valuable than what had been lost. It gave me time, and time, when used correctly, has a way of shifting outcomes in ways that no one expects, and as I stood once more in my kitchen, the light now brighter, the day fully begun, I allowed myself to move forward. Exactly as I always had, knowing that from the outside, nothing had changed, and that was precisely how I intended to keep it, at least for now. By the afternoon, the house had settled into its usual rhythm, the quiet ticking of the clock in the hallway marking time in a way that felt almost deliberate, and I moved through the space as I always had, straightening small things that did not need straightening, adjusting objects that were already in place, not because they required attention, but because it allowed me to think without appearing to, and every movement I made was measured, not slow enough to seem unusual, not hurried enough to suggest urgency, just steady, consistent, familiar, because familiarity is its own kind of camouflage, and as I passed through the living room, my eyes paused briefly on the framed photographs along the shelf, moments captured over decades, birthdays, holidays, quiet afternoons that had once felt secure in their simplicity, and I looked at Daniel's face in one of them, younger, open, unguarded in a way that now felt distant, and I wondered again, not with emotion, but with calculation, how much of this had reached him, how much he had chosen not to see, and whether that distinction would matter later, and I continued on, carrying that question with me without needing an immediate answer, because answers gathered too quickly can sometimes lead you in the wrong direction. And what I needed now was not speed, but precision, and I returned to the kitchen, where the folder remained exactly where I had placed it, undisturbed, blending into the ordinary landscape of the room, and I did not open it again. Because I had already taken what I needed from it for now, instead I reached for my phone once more, scrolling again to that same name, the one I had hesitated over earlier, and this time I did not pause. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, listening as it rang, once, twice, before a voice answered, older, steady, familiar in a way that carried its own kind of reassurance. "This is Thomas Reed," he said, and I allowed myself a small breath before responding, "Thomas, this is Margaret Whitmore," and there was a brief silence, followed by recognition. "Margaret, it has been a long time," and I nodded, though he could not see it. "Yes, it has," I said, my tone even, controlled. "I hope I am not calling at a bad time," and he replied quickly, "Not at all. How can I help you?" And I let that question settle for just a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I understood the importance of how it would be framed. "I need you to review something for me," I said, choosing each word with care, "a series of financial transactions that I believe were made under authority that may not have been fully understood," and there was no immediate response, only a slight shift in his tone when he spoke again, more attentive now, more focused. All right, he said. How extensive are we talking? And I glanced at the folder without opening it. 18 months, I replied. Possibly longer once we look closely. And another brief pause followed. Not hesitation, but consideration, the kind that comes from someone who understands what those words can mean. Do you have documentation? He asked, and I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. Yes, I said. Everything is documented, and that was the truth, perhaps the most important truth in all of this, because whatever had been taken had not been hidden in chaos. It had been recorded, structured, preserved in a way that could be followed. And that changed everything, and Thomas spoke again, his voice now carrying a different weight. Then we should meet, he said, sooner rather than later, and I nodded again. I agree, I replied, but I would prefer discretion for now, and he did not question that. Understood, he said simply, and we arranged a time, a place, details that were ordinary on the surface, but carried significance beneath. And when the call ended, I set the phone down gently, not with relief, not with tension, but with a sense of alignment, as if something that had been waiting to begin had finally been set into motion. And I stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, allowing the quiet to settle again, because this was the point where things shifted from observation to action, but not the kind of action that announces itself, not the kind that creates immediate change. This was the kind that moves beneath the surface, unseen, building structure, gathering strength. And I turned away from the counter, moving back through the house with the same measured pace, the same familiar rhythm, because from the outside, nothing needed to change yet, not for Vanessa, not for Daniel, not for anyone. And that was exactly how it needed to be, because the less they saw, the more clearly I could see. And as the day continued, unfolding in its usual quiet pattern, I carried that understanding with me, not as a burden, but as a tool, something steady, something precise, something that would not be rushed, because whatever came next would not be about reacting to what had been done. It would be about responding in a way that ensured it could not be done again. The following day unfolded exactly as the one before, and that was intentional, because consistency has a way of lowering attention, and I moved through my routine with the same quiet precision, making breakfast at the same time, placing the same cup on the same spot at the table, even leaving the morning news playing softly in the background as I had done for years. And when my phone rang just after 9, I did not reach for it immediately. I let it ring once more before answering, because hesitation, even a small one, can signal uncertainty, and I had none to give. Good morning, I said calmly, and Vanessa's voice came through, light, almost cheerful. Margaret, I just wanted to check in. How are you feeling about everything from yesterday? And I could hear it clearly now, the careful tone, the way she shaped her words to sound supportive while guiding the direction of the conversation, and I allowed a brief pause, just long enough to suggest I was considering my answer. I am fine, I said, my voice even, untroubled, and there was a subtle shift on the other end, a recalibration, as if she had expected something else, perhaps confusion, perhaps concern, something she could step in to manage, but finding none. She adjusted quickly. That is good, she replied. I have been thinking about it, and I really believe it is just a matter of paperwork. You know how complicated these systems can be, and I nodded slightly, though she could not see it. Yes, I said again, offering nothing more, and for a moment there was silence, not uncomfortable, but searching, and then she continued, filling it the only way she knew how, with reassurance that did not ask for permission. Why do not I stop by later? We can go through everything together. I can call the bank if needed, make sure we get this sorted out quickly. And I turned my gaze toward the window, watching the light settle across the yard, letting the moment stretch just enough to feel natural. That will not be necessary today, I said gently. I have a few things to take care of, but I will let you know if I need help. And there it was again, that slight disruption, not visible, but audible. A fraction of a second where her response did not come as smoothly as before. Oh, of course, she said quickly, recovering. Just do not wait too long. These things are easier to fix right away, and I allowed myself a small, polite acknowledgement. I understand. I replied, and we ended the call shortly after. The conversation leaving behind something more valuable than anything she had said directly. It confirmed that she was watching, that she was monitoring not just the accounts, but me, my reactions, my pace, my willingness to involve her. And that meant she was still operating under the same assumption, that I needed her to navigate this, that I would eventually turn back, ask questions, seek guidance, and that assumption created a space, a gap between what she believed and what was actually happening. And I stood there for a moment after setting the phone down, letting that gap settle into my understanding, because it was not just an opportunity, it was a structural weakness in her plan. And I moved through the rest of the morning with that clarity, taking a walk through the neighborhood as I always did, greeting the same neighbors, exchanging the same brief conversations, nothing out of place, nothing that would suggest anything had changed. And when I returned, I did not check the folder, I did not revisit the documents, because I no longer needed to confirm what I already knew. Instead, I focused on what came next, on the meeting I had arranged, on the steps that would follow, each one quiet, each one deliberate. And later that afternoon, as I prepared a simple dinner, I noticed something else, something small but telling, an email notification on my phone from an account I had not accessed in some time. One that Vanessa had once told me was no longer necessary to monitor directly, and I opened it calmly, scanning the message without urgency, a routine update, or at least that was how it appeared, but the timing, the content, the subtle inconsistencies in the way it was structured, they aligned too neatly with everything else I had seen, and I closed it without responding, placing the phone back on the counter as if it had never been opened, because reacting to every detail is how you reveal what you see. And I had no intention of doing that, not yet. And as the evening settled in, the house quiet once more, I sat in the same chair, in the same position, outwardly unchanged, but internally aligned in a way that had not existed before, because now every move Vanessa made, every word she chose, every gesture she offered, would be seen not as help, not as care, but as part of a pattern I understood completely, and that understanding, steady and precise, was something she had not planned for, something she could not see. And that made all the difference. The morning of my meeting arrived without announcement, just another quiet shift in the rhythm of the day, and I dressed the same way I always did when I needed to be taken seriously, not for appearance, but for clarity, a navy blazer, simple blouse. Nothing that asked for attention, nothing that explained itself, and as I stood in front of the mirror, I did not search for reassurance, I only confirmed what I already knew, that I was steady, that I was clear, and that was enough. And the drive across town felt familiar, the same streets, the same turns, but I noticed things differently now, not because they had changed, but because I had. And when I arrived, I parked with the same careful precision I had used for years, turning off the engine and sitting for a moment before stepping out, allowing the stillness to settle around me before I moved forward. And inside, the office was exactly as I remembered, quiet, orderly, the kind of place where nothing happens by accident. And when Thomas greeted me, his expression was professional, but there was something else beneath it, recognition, not just of me, but of the situation I had described. And we sat across from each other at a long table, the folder between us, and I did not rush to speak. I opened it slowly, sliding the documents toward him one section at a time, letting the structure reveal itself without explanation, and he began to review them, his movements measured, his eyes moving carefully across each page, and I watched not for his reaction, but for his process, the way he paused at certain entries, the way he compared dates, the way his expression shifted almost imperceptibly as the pattern became clear, and after some time, he leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, and he did not begin with conclusions, he began with confirmation. These were authorized transfers, he said, not as a question, but as a statement, and I nodded once. Yes, I replied, authorized under a limited power of attorney, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the distinction, limited in scope, he said, but sufficient to execute these transactions. And I allowed a small pause before responding, sufficient, but not necessarily understood, and that was where the conversation shifted, not into emotion, not into accusation, but into definition, into the precise space where legality and intent begin to separate, and he nodded again, this time more deliberately. That is where this becomes significant, he said, and he turned one of the pages back toward me, pointing to a sequence of transfers. This pattern suggests continuity, not isolated action, and I followed his gesture without leaning in, without needing to, because I had already seen it. Yes, I said quietly, and he continued, his tone steady, analytical, which means this is not just about recovery. It is about establishing the full scope of control and how it was exercised, and I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. Exactly, I said, and there was no need to say more, because in that moment, everything aligned, not emotionally, not personally, but structurally, and he closed the folder gently, not as an end, but as a transition. We will need to proceed carefully, he said, documentation, audit, possibly a forensic review of all related accounts. And I listened, not for reassurance, but for sequence, for the order in which things would unfold, and when he finished, I did not ask how long it would take. I did not ask what the outcome would be, because those questions belong to people who are uncertain. And I was not, I understand, I said, and he studied me for a brief moment, perhaps expecting something else, concern, urgency, but finding none, he simply nodded. Then we begin, he said, and that was all that needed to be said. And when I left the office, the afternoon light had shifted again, softer now, less direct, and I walked back to my car with the same steady pace, carrying nothing visible in my hands. But something had changed. Something had moved from thought into structure, from observation into action, and as I drove home, I considered the timing of everything, the way Vanessa would continue as she had, the way she would expect me to follow a predictable path, confusion, reliance, eventual dependence. And I understood now that the most effective response would be the one she did not see, the one that did not interrupt her pattern until it was already too late to adjust. And when I pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had, unchanged, waiting. And I stepped inside with the same calm I had carried all morning, placing my keys in their usual spot, moving through the space without hesitation, because from the outside, nothing had shifted, nothing had been revealed, and that was exactly how it needed to remain. Because the more stable everything appeared, the less likely anyone was to question it, and I allowed that stillness to settle around me once more, knowing that beneath it, something far more deliberate was already in motion. Something that would not be rushed, would not be announced, but would unfold with the same precision that had once been used against me, only this time, I was the one setting the pace. It was 3 days later, when Vanessa came by unannounced, and I knew the moment I saw her car pull into the driveway that something in the rhythm had shifted, not because she suspected anything fully, but because uncertainty had begun to settle into the spaces where confidence once lived, and I watched her through the window for a brief moment before opening the door, not hiding, not delaying, simply allowing the timing to remain natural. And when I greeted her, my expression was the same as it had always been, calm, composed, welcoming in a way that gave nothing away. "Vanessa," I said, stepping aside to let her in, and she entered with that same polished presence, her eyes moving quickly through the room, taking in details without appearing to, searching for signs, changes, disruptions, anything that might confirm or dismiss whatever concern had brought her here, and she smiled. Of course she did, that same controlled, reassuring smile. "I was in the area," she said lightly, "and I thought I would stop by. See how you are doing?" And I nodded, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I am doing well," I replied. "Would you like some coffee?" And she hesitated just a fraction before agreeing, following me in, and as I moved through the familiar motions, setting out 2 cups, pouring slowly, placing one in front of her, I could feel her watching me, not openly, but carefully, waiting for something to surface, and when nothing did, she began to speak, filling the silence the way she always had. "I have been Thinking about the bank, she said, her tone measured, and I spoke to someone I know. They said these things can look worse than they are at first. Sometimes it is just how the accounts are structured, and I listened, not interrupting, not correcting, allowing her words to settle into the space between us, and when she finished, I took a small sip of my coffee, placing the cup back down with quiet precision. That is possible, I said, my voice even, and for a moment, she seemed to study me more closely, as if trying to reconcile what she expected with what she was seeing, and that was when I reached for the folder, not quickly, not dramatically, simply as if it were part of the natural flow of the conversation, and I placed it on the table between us, resting my hand on it for just a second before sliding it slightly toward her. I spent some time reviewing everything, I said calmly, and her eyes moved to the folder immediately. Not opening it yet, but registering its presence, its weight, its meaning, and there was a shift then, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that happens when something unspoken becomes real, and she let out a small breath, controlled, careful. That is good, she said, though her tone had changed, less certain now. It is always better to understand these things fully, and I nodded once. Yes, I replied, and I opened the folder, not all the way, just enough to reveal the top pages, the transaction history, the structured pattern, the details that spoke for themselves without needing explanation, and I did not point to anything, I did not highlight, I simply let it be seen, and for a few seconds, she did not move, her eyes fixed on the pages, her expression composed but no longer entirely relaxed, and then she reached forward, slowly, as if testing the reality of what was in front of her, and as her fingers touched the paper, I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, but with a clarity that did not leave room for misunderstanding. I met with someone yesterday, I said, and she paused, her hand still resting on the edge of the folder, and she looked up at me, her eyes searching now, not guiding, not managing, but searching. Someone who understands these things in detail, I continued, my tone steady, and we are going to review everything carefully, and the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was no longer a space she could fill easily, no longer something she could shape with explanation, and I held her gaze, not challenging, not confrontational, simply present, and after a moment, she withdrew her hand slightly, sitting back in her chair. Her posture still composed, but her control no longer complete, and she opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to redirect, but I did not give her the space to do so, not by interrupting, but by continuing in the same calm, measured tone. There is no need to go through it now, I said, closing the folder gently. This will take time, and I lifted my cup again, taking another small sip, as if the conversation were no more significant than any other, and that was when it became clear. Not through anything she said, but through what she did not say, that the balance had shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough for her to understand that something had changed, that the assumptions she had been operating under no longer held, and as she sat there, her eyes no longer quite as certain, her smile no longer quite as steady, I realized that this was not the moment of confrontation, not the moment of resolution. It was something more precise than that. It was the moment where control begins to move, quietly, deliberately, from one place to another, and I did not need to say anything else, because what mattered had already been understood.